Oh, yeah, yeah. Um, oh, and Ray made it too. Okay, well, maybe I will chat about some of the things that I have in mind. Um, hey, Ray, how's it going? So, most of what I'll talk about here is things that I've found really like work and don't work, basically via my own experience, but maybe others have better tips and tricks to give as well. And so don't let me make this sound like this is like the best thing ever. So one thing I found, this is not too long ago, is so I really like code workbooks. I think they're a really cool interface for sort of designing pipelines, and it gives me sort of a neat way to see and um, interact with things. I do wish that they were a little bit better about encapsulation. So like I wish I could like draw a box around a group of nodes and like shrink them down to one node or something, just so that I could like visualize things a little bit better. At one point recently, I was working on a really big code workbook that had a number of templates in it, and I think it had like almost 100 nodes in it. And that worked out kind of cool, right? Because I can like group them spatially and with color groups, and then I could easily zoom into different things, and I could really navigate around my code really easily. But I've been finding that once you get up to above like 75 nodes, it just the responsiveness of the interface drops a whole lot, and I had a lot more bugs. So like one thing that happened was my templates sort of somehow got detached from the actual code that was running them, and I couldn't even edit them anymore. And so I ended up having to refactor a bunch of stuff out into separate workbooks. So that's what I'm doing now, is I'm sort of putting things into like, themed workbooks, where I might have, like a data munging workbook, and then one that does the statistical analysis, and maybe one that does um, visualization and stuff like that. I don't know if others have had a similar experience or not. Another handy thing that I found, especially when I've broken things out into separate workbooks this way, is to create color groups, especially for like the inputs. And so maybe I'd make like these, and sometimes I make separate color groups if my input is like a source input, a shared source input. And then I'll also take I'll also usually make a group for like use downstream. So that I know like, okay, these are the ones that are going to be coming from somewhere, and this is the one that's going to be used somewhere downstream in my own analysis. And then over here, this is the one that is used from that one that I labeled as downstream. And so I might want to create a color group for inputs here. And I made this one dark pink because it sort of like helps me indicate to myself that this is an input which is not based on the original sort of data, whereas I might also have an OMOP inputs group if I also loaded up one of the source tables or something. So I can sort of distinguish between, my own upstream inputs, the upstream inputs that are sort of created by N3C, and then maybe even I'd have another color group or something for inputs that are coming from a colleague's tables. The other thing that I found as I'm working along, and I just find myself getting more and more frustrated when I'm dealing with different versions of things. This is especially in the long COVID project, where they're sort of releasing like subversions of the data depending on the upstream branches, is I'm finding that not using master and instead of pinning to a branch is helping me out a lot. I see your chat now, Johanna, splitting data prep and analysis, yeah, into separate workbooks. So often what I'll do is I will input a particular branch and just pin to that branch. Because if I'm using master, and this is one thing if I'm using master based on the original OMOP inputs, but if I'm using master from a colleague's table, for example, and their master is based on a master of some other table, and their master is based on a master of some other table, anywhere along the line, my master can get out of sync with its upstream inputs. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's what I want, you know, oh, okay, I'm not going to rerun any of this because I was basing it on master as of July 8th, 2022, which was release whatever. But 4 months down the road, I need some way to remember that that was based on master as of July 8th, 2022. And that Lineage Explorer can help you do that. Actually, it has tools where you can sort of go back and see what branch you were dependent on and when it was built. But then I sort of have to go, okay, well, that was based on master of that branch, which was created in, you know, early May. And that one was based on master of this other workbook, which was created in early April. And it can get really messy. So pinning to branches in inputs, I think is just really good practice, especially as you get your projects working over longer terms and you're interacting with more people. The other thing that I've found that helps avoid this is to create my own branches and not really do much work in master of my own workbooks. So for example, here, my inputs, I'm using the November 9th inputs for this is the Cynthia data. And so I would create a workbook, or I'd make a branch here where it's like release November 9 or whatever release it is. And then I would need to run these nodes on this branch if I actually want to name this branch. So I'll say run all downstream. And then similarly down here, rather than importing master here, I would import the one that I created via that branch on that workbook. Like so. So those are just my thoughts on branching. You know, I used to use master a lot, but I've sort of fallen into my software development mindset of just pinning to versions. That way I always know what I'm working on. I always know what something was and where it's going. I wish I could encourage others to do the same, because then if they don't, I have to go against their master, and then I have to track down what version that particular thing was and what release it was and so on and so forth. Let's see, what else can I say here? I think that's about it. The branching thing I wanted to mention, the color groups to help me identify, you know, sort of inputs and outputs. Of course, you can have color groups for all kinds of different things in between those, but those are really nice. That way I can sort of say, oops, that should be this color. That way I can sort of say, okay, I need to rerun this branch. And similarly, if this one is inputting on release November 9, I would also create a commonly named branch here.
Say again, what you're saying is use the same branch name in two different workbooks so that you can recognize them as corresponding to the same data freeze, so to speak?
Correct.
Okay.
And that helps a little bit with the data lineage tool as well. So let's open the data lineage tool. You can do that by opening a data set and then saying like view data lineage, but it's also handy to be able to just create a new sort of data lineage graph that doesn't have anything in it. And you can do that with the, actually, can you? Well, maybe not. So if I go to one of these, and let's say I want to look at the data lineage of this one, lots of different ways to get to that. So if I want to create a data lineage for the stuff in one workbook, often what I'll do is I'll remove I'll open the data lineage sort of somewhere, and then I'll add resources. And what's kind of neat about being able to add resources is you can go to the folder that contains all of the resources that you want to import. In this case, which folder are we in today? Here. So I'd say, okay, let's open up, add all data sets here and in subfolders. Or you can say add 2 new data sets in current view. And if you have a complicated workbook and you add all the data sets, it'll end up also showing the connections between them, which is handy. If you end up importing a bunch of data sets, so let's say you're working on your code workbook for a while, and you save your data sets, which is pretty common to do. I just sort of save all the nodes, and then you import them, or maybe you delete those transforms. Like, okay, I don't need that one. Well, the old data set is still hanging around, right? It's just not sort of connected to anything. The nice thing is when you import everything in a subfolder, if you have an old data set whose transform has been deleted, the data set will still show up in here. It just won't be connected to anything. And so that can be handy to identify those sort of old stale data sets. And then you can go back in the output folder for the code workbook and delete them, or just note what's not really connected anymore.
Excuse me, Sean.
Yep.
Could I just ask a question? This is an interface I've never really figured out how to read it. What does the well, let's call it a less than sign on the left of your 2 nodes there? What does that less than sign on the left hand? What is the significance of those markings?
This expands the nodes that are inputs into it. And so if I want to see the things that went into that particular node, I can click on that and it will show me the 2 inputs that I also see in the code workbook view.
Okay, and then what happens if you click on, because they also look like they have inputs, although I don't see any inputs in the
right. So
in the code workbook.
So the cool thing about the data lineage is that it can span multiple workbooks. It can also span repos. So this is really looking at things at the level of the transform and the data set, regardless of whether that transform and data set was generated by a repo or a workbook or another workbook or whatever it is. And this is a really handy thing to know when you're working on, say, master, right? And so you say, okay, I built my, and so this does have an upstream thing that is just sort of hidden. This would be like in the data catalog, that's a little check thing shows. And so you can say like, okay, the master here, and you can choose which branch you're seeing of these things, was based on the master here. But let's say I wanted to see the branch that I created. And so that's that one. Now I'm seeing on this one, it's showing me the branch. And if I were to click down here, I can see the code on that particular branch for that particular node. And I'm looking at the release November 9th. And so this is saying that we're looking at the release November 9th branch of these transforms and their associated data sets. But those are based on the master branch of this one. And so when I have a branch selected up here and there's no corresponding branch for the particular data set or transform, it shows me this little input, this little icon that basically says, hey, we're working on a fallback branch. So the November 9th release branch of this data set was based on the master of this data set. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks.
The other kind of neat thing, so one thing I like to do is even if I have a plot or something and it's not returning any data that I care about, like this just returns an empty data frame, I like to save these too, because then they can show up in the data lineage as well. So now I think this thing is automatically quickly updated to say, oh, look, we have an output of this particular one, which is that data set that I saved there. So now I have my visualizations also in this data lineage tool so that I can work with them. Now, once you have a graph built in the data lineage tool, you can sort of save this graph so that later on I can reopen it. So I'll do that. I'll click on, I don't want to save it as a frame over here in the save business. So I would save it probably in the same folder. Where to go? Oops, just right there. And I would say maybe analysis pipeline, something like that. That way I can reopen this view and I don't have to sort of like re-import stuff, expand out the inputs that I want, unexpand the inputs that I don't want. In this particular view, there are various ways to color the nodes. And you can do that, I think it's under this one, node color options. So you can color nodes based on whether they're in a data catalog, or you can color nodes based on which folder they're in. You can color nodes based on the repository. And in this case, a code workbook is basically called a repository. So in this case, these are sourced from a code workbook called versioning, which exists somewhere else that put that data in the data catalog. These are in my condition stats code workbook, and this is in my viz condition stats code workbook. Other handy ways to be able to color things. Oh, look, there's a type. Code workbook versus repository. You can schedule things by, or you can view things by branch. That can be very handy too. So since I'm doing this branch thing, and if I don't like seeing this little itty bitty icon to see whether or not I'm doing a fallback branch, I can color the nodes by the branch that I'm currently looking at. There's, what else is there? And then there's the custom color option. This is pretty cool, because what this allows me to do is to select multiple inputs. Oops. And then I can click color. Where did those go? Right here. And I can create a color group inside of this particular application. And so here I might say, okay, these are inputs. Maybe these are I'll call them data munging. And then this one is maybe visualization. The nice thing about being able to group things, whether it's your own custom color group or it's another sort of color group, is that you can select nodes based on the particular group that you want. So if I want, I could click on data munging and that selects all those particular nodes. Or if I select upstream inputs, that selects all those nodes. And if I hold control, then I can select multiple groups. Now, the reason that this is handy is that it allows me to rerun parts of my pipeline from this particular interface. And the way you do that is you select some set of nodes. You can use the sort of draggy or selectee, or if you've defined color groups, you can sort of say, okay, I want to select my data munging nodes and my upstream input nodes. Oops, not my upstream input nodes, but my visualization nodes. And then you open up this little manage builds drawer, and then you could submit a build for the selected data sets only. Now it will know that we don't need to rebuild these because they've been built on this branch already. So it's not actually going to build anything. If I want to force a rebuild, I can select that. And then these are the ones that will be built. And then I can run the build. One handy thing that you can do with this, and I've enjoyed doing this, is using branches to create different sort of experimental designs or to experiment with different parameter settings and things. So I'm going to save this. Oh no, it's already saved. I think it auto saves. So let's say I wanted to adjust my data munging, stats, and I said, you know what, I'm really interested in instead of the condition start date, I'm going to look at the condition end date. Oops. But before I do that, I'm going to create a new branch. So I'm going to call this SO release no 9 end date test. So that creates that branch on this particular on these particular nodes. And so over here, I should be able to, if I select one of them, I'll have to refresh it. Oh, I didn't save my custom color groups. Oh yeah, this you do have to explicitly save. It doesn't auto save. So after, okay, it does take it a minute, but eventually that new branch will show up here and I can select it. And you'll notice that now it's basically saying, okay, these exist on that branch because I created the branch, but I never ran it. And that branch is falling back to master over here. And this data set, there's no branch that by that name that exists there. So what I can do is I can also go to my downstream one, and I'll create a branch with the same name. This is much easier if you have everything in one notebook. What did I call it? End date test. Okay, so now I have my end date test and there's a connection to it. But there's no branch. Let me make sure. This might just take a moment. And right, because it's asking me, oh, you loaded the workbook and when you saved it, you were on a different branch. So I'll say, yeah, switch branches and load graph. There we go. So now if I want, I can say, all right, I'm on this particular branch and I want to rerun my munging steps and my viz step with those updated changes. So I can select those. And then over here, I can say, let's kick off a build. And now it knows that they need to be built because they haven't been built on that branch before. And I can click on run build. And that submits that build as a job. The cool thing about this is that I can do this again. So let's say this is something that takes like, 2 hours to run. I could do a variety of these tests. I could come back and I can say, you know what, I want to try something else. I want to say release November 9 other test. And maybe I only need to run this particular portion of that. But I'll do that here anyway. And once this refreshes, I can kick off a build on this new branch. So I can sort of create branches in bulk depending on different parameterizations. Maybe I want a branch where I've set the parameter to 10, and then I want a branch where I've set the parameter to 20, and then I create a branch where I've set the parameter to 30. Then I can go in here. This one doesn't exist yet. Oh, I misnamed it. See, that's one of the tricky things is if you're doing this across workbooks, it helps to have the same name. Okay. So now I'm looking at this other branch that I've created, but I never ran the branch here, right? So it's on this fallback branch master here. Nevertheless, I'm on this branch, and so I can say, you know what, I want to run my munging nodes and my viz node, and I'm going to kick off another build. So even if this takes a few hours, what's the nice thing I found about it is that I can sort of create a bunch of branches with a bunch of different parameterizations, and then come into here and kick off the builds that I need. And then, the next morning I wake up and they've run overnight, and I can sort of see the results from all those different branches. And as a bonus, I get the pinned version of my output so that I can reuse these things across different notebooks or repositories. And I always know the provenance of my data with a quick check of the branch name. So that's about all that I had. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I'm getting a little bit of the hang of how to use that tool, which I've been avoiding just because the interface seems so complicated, but now you've given me some handle on it.
It is a complicated tool, but yeah, it's also a pretty powerful one. Good way to keep lots of computers hot. Especially if you have R nodes. So if you do a lot with R in a code workbook, you can only be running one R node at a time. And while one is running, you can't create a branch and then resubmit that on the other branch, I think. Whereas with the data lineage tool, you can sort of kick off branches and have them, sort of queue up behind each other, or even run simultaneously if they're able to do so. So those would be my big tips. Use branching to pin versions, both inputs and outputs. Find some way to identify which nodes are your inputs and your outputs that are going to be used downstream. And then use the data explorer or the data lineage tool to work with kicking off jobs for different branches of the data sets. Someday I'll have to learn about build schedules and learn how to do that. I'm going to stop the recording here.